This pedal, the steel guitar community calls it the Franklin pedal. It still makes me cringe when they say that, but I was the first one to come up with the concept. But it does some cool things. So I can go, and then next to it.
Well, warm welcome back to this series, and this is actually now the fifth part in this new series called The Stars of Steel. It's highlighting the steel guitarists in country western music. Today's artist is one who, for a really long time, was always the new kid on the block in the steel guitar community. And ironically, the new kid on the block is turning 71 this year. So he actually has been around in the world of steel guitar and country music for a good period of time now. And his name is Paul Franklin. He's been the leading steel guitarist in Nashville and in country music for about the last 30 or 40 years. And he has absolutely made his mark and his place in the story of the steel guitar. Like Lloyd Green, he was a child prodigy. Like Buddy Emmons, he is a multi-instrumentalist. And he grew up to not only become a world-class steel guitarist, but also he is an inventor and an innovator. And now very much so an educator and a teacher, and really an ambassador for the steel guitar. And like Buddy Emmons before him, Paul Franklin is also going to have the name Franklin instead of Emmons on the front of his double neck steel guitar that he's so often seen playing in videos. Like each of the players already featured in this series, Paul Franklin is also going to take the steel guitar far away from Music City into the world of pop and rock. He's going to work with the Dire Straits famously, and he's also going to record with artists like Sting, Barbra Streisand, and of course, everybody's favorite, Megadeth. In these first 10 episodes here, attempting to create a framework for which we can go off and explore the whole world of steel guitar and something that we can tie everything back to in some way. And so these first few videos that I've made are really featuring what I believe are the core pioneers and innovators and the early masters of the instrument. And you're going to see, in fact, in this very episode, how already we're going to be referencing some of the players that have been mentioned previously. And so today is episode 5, Paul Franklin. Since he arrived in Nashville in the early 1970s, Paul Franklin, he's been inducted into the Steel Guitar Hall of Fame in 2020. He's in the Musicians Hall of Fame. 2019 he was inducted. And he's been nominated 32 times by the CMA for Musician of the Year. And he's also never won it. So he actually might hold the record for the most nominations without winning a category at an award show as well, which I think he has a sense of humor about by this point. I mean, NPR actually wrote an article specifically about him being nominated that many times and not having won it. So who knows? He might win it this year. 2025 could be the year that Paul Franklin wins. He's actually been quite active recently as well, even though he's getting up there in age now, like the rest of us. He's just put out an album in 2023, Vince Gill and Paul Franklin, called Sweet Memories. And that's the music of Ray Price and the Cherokee Cowboys. He was also a member of the Time Jumpers. 15 years he spent with them, the recent 15 years. And he's just stepped down from playing with them full time. And as you know, the Time Jumpers are the Western swing band that plays every Monday night in Nashville, Tennessee. They've been doing that for since about 1998. So we'll examine Paul's trademark style. We're going to look at his session work, of course, as a collaborator, as well as his solo albums, which just a few. But of course, like always, we'll start with a bit of background on this new kid in town. And his name is Paul Franklin, and he's from Detroit, Michigan. So Paul Franklin is born in 1954. He's born May 31st, 1954, way up north in Detroit, as I mentioned. And Detroit's a long ways from Nashville, Tennessee. So Paul's story is going to be a little bit different. He's not from one of the Appalachian states like his predecessors. But that year, 1954, not only is it the birth year of Paul Franklin, but that's a pretty big year in the story of the steel guitar for another reason. So can you remember why? I'll give you a minute to think about that. And if the song Slowly comes to mind by Webb Pierce with Bud Isaacs, so that was the year and the first time, all things considered, that we heard the distinct pedal steel guitar sound, that string bending happening on a country western record that was produced in Nashville, Tennessee. Paul comes from a big family, a musical family, and everyone in that family played an instrument. And so Paul's father, Paul Franklin Sr., he was kind of a fan of the steel guitar, of the lap steel. And he suggested that Paul might try playing lap steel, and he did. And he really took to it right away. He just had a natural flair for this instrument. And Paul Franklin Sr., he's going to play a big old part, if not a key part, in his son's music career and in the success and the fame of Paul Franklin Jr. I'll show you here a nice picture. There's a nice picture of young Paul Franklin. Well, two things happen at this time. He's not only one of the youngest steel guitarists in the country, but he's also the only steel guitarist in the state of Michigan who's an active member of the Musicians Union, because he joined the union at a very young age. As a result of that, his first sessions as a steeler are going to be backing up some world-class Motown albums. Not country music by any means, but very interesting music for a young kid to be a part of. And why do you think that these Motown records, why were they even hiring a steel guitarist, you might ask? Well, you also remember from episode 3 on Pete Drake. Pete Drake was playing on this little Bob Dylan song called Lay Lady Lay. And the popularity of Dylan at the time made it so that when that song came out, everyone was all of a sudden interested in the pedal steel guitar and looking to experiment with it in their up-and-coming, in their current projects. So Paul, he recalls recording with James Jamerson and even being on a session with Stevie Wonder playing keys. And not long after these early sessions, Paul decides he's going to move to Nashville, Tennessee, and his father goes with him. Now, Paul is actually going to say later that he regrets leaving Michigan so early, because now that he's has the wisdom and all this time to look back, he realized that there was a really special scene of music, not country, but a special scene happening there that he wished he would have stuck around a few more years just to be a part of that. And I would argue here that one of the key factors in Paul Franklin's story is going to be the idea of serendipity. That word, serendipity, when we think about that, you have to have some serendipity in life to be in the right place, be in the right time, and to really get to that on the big stages in show business. It does require a little bit of that, and we're going to see in Paul's story time and time again where these very serendipitous moments are going to happen. For example, Pete Drake, another serendipitous character, he is going to be one of the first people that Paul Franklin makes a relationship with, and Pete Drake actually is going to give Paul's wife a job, as I understand it. I think an office job working for his publishing company, and he's going to start to give some of the session work that's booked for him, for Pete. He's going to start to give some of that to Paul Franklin. Now, the big difference between these two players, Pete Drake and Paul Franklin, of course, is going to be that Paul Franklin is a virtuoso guitarist, like he's a virtuoso steeler. But nevertheless, Paul has some early gigs backing up another steeler, Barbara Mandrell, playing for her, touring with her. And a lot of time early he spends with Jerry Reed, touring and recording with Jerry Reed, which would have been a pretty killer influence to have. And he's playing in Mel Tillis's Statesiders band. And he's recording with Mel Tillis a little bit. And around this time, when Paul's just arriving in Nashville, he talks about being on a 2-year waiting list for a Showbud guitar. So Paul's father, who was an engineer and a very industrious kind of guy, he knew how to work in machinery and things like that. He decided he would just build Paul his own steel guitar. And sure enough, he did it. That in itself is something that Paul's going to be known for around the world for this Franklin guitar. So really kind of, if you think of the whole thing here, is already kind of an amazing story, very interesting story of Paul Franklin. And just a few years after that prototype guitar that was built, Paul Sr. is actually going to build the first ever Dobro pedal steel, which is effectively called the Pedabro. And this is a pedal steel guitar with a resonator plate on it. And it's quite a loud guitar, even unplugged. And Paul Franklin Jr. noticed that he was being asked to play dobro in a lot of sessions in the 80s, and he thought to himself, if he could just use pedals somehow, he would really be able to create a new style and a new sound in dobro. So his father took it upon himself and made the instrument. And next thing you know, Paul's using this. In the first recording that Paul says that he used it on was Forever and Ever Amen by Randy Travis, which was a huge hit song, as I'm sure you remember. But that's not the only song or record that Pedabro was used on. In fact, when I go back now and look at some of those albums and songs, I'm just realizing as I make this video that for the first time that's Pedabro being played. Originally, when I heard those songs, I would have just thought it was a dobro. My ears wouldn't have caught the fact that it was actually those strings were bending and being pulled like a steel guitar. Copyright claims have been piling up here on these videos I've made, so I'm going to show you a sample right now of something that's not Paul Franklin playing, but I just want to show you what the Franklin Pedabro looks like and what it sounds like. So check out this very brief clip here. So along with Brent Mason, Paul Franklin is part of this new generation of Nashville cats. Kind of like the A-team players before them. Well, there's Nashville now in the 80s and 90s is new studios, new producers, new people. And Paul Franklin and Brent Mason are going to be basically the guitar players playing on 70, 80, maybe 90% of all the records being made in Nashville for these decades. Paul also has a performing gig in Nashville. Get this, it's subbing for Buddy Emmons in a weekly show that would be sort of a precursor to the Time Jumpers. That was the Buddy Spiker Show. The Buddy Spiker Show took place at a hotel, I forget which one there in Nashville, and it was Lenny Breau often playing guitar. They were just like a jam session. So now Paul is playing with them, and that's serendipity again. And so I think that in fact he ends up playing on some Chet Atkins sessions as a result of befriending Paul Yandel. The merging of these events is going to get us to this big part in the Paul Franklin story, and that's when Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits comes to Nashville to make a record, The Notting Hillbillies. So this is a side project of Mark Knopfler, and he's recording with Nashville musicians. And Chet calls in, I think Chet must have been working as a mentor. Chet is not credited as the producer on this album, but he called up Paul Franklin and had him come play on this on one afternoon in the studio. And I guess, according to Paul, he said that him and Mark just hit it off immediately. And this is going to pay dividends for Paul Franklin because his life is going to be changed forever by what is about to take place. In fact, let's hear a clip of Paul telling the story himself, just a little bit about working in the studio with Mark Knopfler for the first time.
So rehearsals for the record. And I asked Mark, I said, what do you want me to play? He said, Paulie, he said, you have to remember that every preconceived notion of your instrument is in America. He said, you're going to play music for the world.
Yeah.
And he said, the sound of this instrument is just as new as a synthesizer or anything else. He said, just fit the music.
Yeah.
He said, you don't have to color it into something else. And that is, that's monumental in itself. Because we relate the instrument always as all that kind of crazy stuff is country. But if you go like calling Elvis or something like that, then you hear the instrument, it's not country anymore. So
Right.
he opened the door to just play it. We're noodling, what we call.
Right.
And I'm sitting doing, this is my exercise. Just to loosen up my hands.
Yeah.
And so Carl starts playing along with it. And then the next thing I hear is Mark goes, calling Elvis. Is anybody home? Da, da, da. And that we just started that. It shifted just like that. And so my point in saying that is not that that's anything genius. The genius was Mark Knopfler,
Right.
realizing he let go of any of his preconceived notions about composition.
So Paul's going to go on quite a journey with Mark Knopfler and Dire Straits, and he'll be playing arena tours, like these really huge concerts. Again, these are kind of places and realms that the steel guitar really hasn't been before. It's around this time that he starts receiving one of his many CMA nominations for Musician of the Year, and he eventually forms a friendship with Vince Gill. It's going to lead up right up to current day. As of the time of making this video, they've just put out an album in 2023. Paul joined the Time Jumpers, which I'm sure many of you, like myself, have had a chance to go see that Time Jumpers show in Nashville. In fact, let's check out a clip of Paul playing with the Time Jumpers. Vince is there with him, and this will lead us into the next segment of this video, which will be the trademark style and sound of Paul Franklin.
Hold that thing a little tighter if you can. I'll switch up the mix.
So Paul's sound, his trademark signature sound and style, well, I have to admit that this one is a bit of a struggle for me. I don't really have a particular trademark sound that comes to mind when I think of Paul Franklin. I actually think of his style as a mix of all of the styles of the Steelers we've been talking about so far in this series. He's very much a master emulator. He has almost like AI powers when it comes to just dialing in anything that you want to hear in the history of steel guitar. He really is that much of a walking, living, breathing database. But anyway, I reached out to a steel guitarist who's met Paul and worked at some concerts with him, and he said that a big part of Paul's sound is the Franklin guitar that he uses. Those Franklin guitars built by Paul Franklin Sr., they in fact all have a very unique tone to them, so that would be one thing. Paul's sound is rooted in the classic country of the 80s and 90s, where you'll notice in the production that the drums are starting to sound a lot bigger in country music. They're really filling up the mix quite a bit. If you think about Shania Twain and Garth Brooks and how much the sound of country music has changed from where it's come from, most of the mid-range of classic steel guitarists has been scooped out in the mix to get those high highs and to really cut through the music. And so what Paul Franklin discovered was that he had to bring the mids back in order to track with artists like Shania Twain and Garth Brooks, who were using a much heavier rock and roll based, not rock and roll, but arena rock sound in their production. So by keeping the mids in, Paul is able to have a little more presence and attack in the mix. So we can say that, I guess we could say that Paul's signature sound is a thick Nashville E9 country style, and maybe a little bit less sparkly than the players of the 60s and 70s. Next, we will look at the session work, the discography of work that Paul is credited as having played on. Paul actually charted on a #1 hit way back when he was still living in Detroit with a band called Gallery, and their hit song was "It's So Nice to Be With You." So before he even gets to Nashville, he's already played on a #1 song as a teenager. So I'm bringing up Discogs here. So during this era of the 80s and 90s, it's actually not that uncommon for there to have been 2 steel guitarists credited on an album. So consider that as we look at these titles here. This is one of the first records by a fairly well-known artist, Tommy Cash, brother of Johnny Cash, and this is around 1978, I believe. That's 1975. Okay, so it's a little bit earlier than that. So that's kind of one of the first ones. Yeah, he does play on some Melba Montgomery records. We talked about him playing with Jerry Reed. Yeah, so another artist, George Strait. When you think about Paul Franklin's sound, remember that he's playing on a lot of the big George Strait records from the 1980s, and there's a lot of steel guitar in that music. Check this out. This is a Guitar Town, Steve Earle Guitar Town. I don't know that Paul plays on every track on that album. I wouldn't know for sure, but if you do know, please let me know in the comments. This is a huge George Strait album, Oceanfront Property. Yeah, he's credited on a few Lyle Lovett records as well. This is a very funny-looking Johnny Paycheck album called Modern Times. I have seen that one around before. And this is the big one by Randy Travis, Always and Forever. And that is going to be Paul Franklin on there. There's another steel guitarist on there as well that's credited, because in that song, for example, Forever and Ever Amen, there's actually a Pedabro and a steel guitar both in that song. And I don't know that they're both Paul Franklin. I think that they're not, actually. Let's see. Should be listed here. Yeah, Doyle Grisham is listed as being the steel guitarist. So just worth pointing that out, I think. Patty Loveless, Tammy Wynette record. He's playing on this Higher Ground, Tammy Wynette record. That's a very obscure Tammy Wynette record for me. Rodney Crowell, again, big time record, 8x10, Randy Travis. Yeah, and so another thing is the Keith Whitley connection. Paul's playing on a bunch of the Keith Whitley records, and of course, Keith Whitley is a very loved country music singer that was gone too soon. He started out in the bluegrass world, and so that's something that will be a big part of Paul's legacy, having played on those records. We see he's pairing with Vince Gill here on an early Vince Gill record. And Alan Jackson showing up. He's playing Pedabro on this album by Don Williams. Some really nice stuff. Of course, Don Williams' albums always had Lloyd Green, and they always had great steel, great dobro parts in them, even though he often didn't perform with a steel guitarist on stage. His albums were full of beautiful steel guitar. I guess he's on this record, Chet Atkins and Mark Knopfler, neck to neck. That would make sense. And this is one of those later Waylon Jennings albums. I like these later, more obscure albums from Waylon. I find there's always a lot of interesting songs on them. The Judds. And this is just a very abbreviated list, just abbreviated selection that I put together so that we can see. No, there's a Hank Jr. record. That's a big Hank Jr. record. Glenn Campbell. Ricky Skaggs. I mean, Ricky Skaggs has reinvented himself as a bluegrasser for the second time, but he also had that big career as a country artist, made I think some of the best country western music of the 1980s, I think, was Ricky Skaggs. Check this out. He's even on a Faith Hill record here. Willie, Bellamy Brothers. This was a very big record. I see it now. Tracy Lawrence. 2 Steelers on that one. Kenny Chesney. The Bradley Barnes Sessions. He plays on one of the songs off of that famous George Jones album. This is very cool. The Tattooed Heart, Aaron Neville. Aaron Neville did some really great stuff. Really great country western songs. He worked on a couple of compilation albums and doing country stuff, and it's really great. Steel especially great on it. Yeah, this is the album here that I'm speaking of. This is a wonderful album. The songs of Jimmy Rogers, and Aaron Neville is singing "Why Should I Be So Lonesome, Why Should I Be So Blue." Beautiful steel guitar in it. I wish I could play it for you. And then once I saw Rascal Flatts, I knew it was time to stop scrolling, because now we're getting into music that this is not really the kind of music I talk about on this channel, but this is like around 2005, and I pretty much stopped gathering information at that point. So I think there's like altogether 1,600 albums that he's credited on. Yeah, he has 1,400 credits as a steel guitar player. I mean, that's got to be more than Pete Drake, actually. Just because of the fact probably that when in Pete's time, stuff wasn't documented as well. Certainly not on the album jackets and so forth. Yes, you can see that Pete only has 1,000 credits. But of course, because of the era, there's so much stuff he would have been uncredited on. But that is kind of an interesting thing to think about. It's time now for my favorite part of these videos, and that is the solo work of the artist, their own instrumental albums. It's not much of a list at all, in fact. It's just 6 records here. So let's start at the top. So Just Pickin', 1979 on Midland Records. Let's dive into this one here. I mean, I would love to have one of these records. So 63 people looking for it. There are 10 copies available on Discogs, starting at $21. But he's doing C-Jam Blues, Song for Sarah, Rocky Top. Really interesting. You know, Paul has said in interviews that he didn't really like instrumental. He didn't like making instrumental country music albums. We can see here that that's for sure. But this just looks like I'm really, really curious to know what this record sounds like. This album, Just Pickin', by Paul Franklin, you can't find it for streaming anywhere, and I can't find an example of anyone who's ever uploaded it to YouTube. There's not even a pirated way to listen to it, so it's very, very obscure. But while looking for it, I did find another steel guitarist covering this song here, Just Pickin'. I think this might have been a Paul Franklin original instrumental. I'm going to show you a sample right now of what this sounds like, because I don't think you've ever heard an instrumental guitar track that sounds like this. It's very, very unique. So that's the Paul Franklin Just Pickin' record that came out in 1979 on Midland Records. He had a cassette that came out called Over the Limit. This one was only made on cassette. Yep, Laser Dance, Over the Limit Part 2. I would guess that some of these are originals as well. Another album that would be really interesting to have, especially because of how big of a steel guitarist Paul Franklin is. And it's kind of funny to me that there's so few albums. There's one more, essentially, and it's this one here. It's Play by Play. I don't know if there's a year on this, but this is what the album artwork looks like on it. Play by Play with Paul Cook, Wayne Harrison, Randy Houser. Interesting. This is on Franklin Records. Again, this just very much in the universe of extremely obscure records that you will probably never in your life find. But I'll find it. Leave it to me. I'll get a copy of it and show it to you when I do. There's 5 copies available on Discogs, of course. You're going to have to pay for shipping and everything else to get. Anybody who's heard any of these records, please write in the comments and let us know what you make of them. Now, it has the 2 Vince Gill records here, Bakersfield, and that one from 2023, music Ray Price. And there's also, worth noting, the last one is this Christmas collection that is a CD. Compact disc. And Paul Franklin is playing the steel on all of this stuff. So if you'd like to hear Christmas music, you can hear him doing that. Looks like, when did this come out actually? It does not say anywhere. There's no year attached to it. Let's look at the cover art. Yep. It looks like a CD. So there it is. So that is the library of solo Paul Franklin albums. And as for what you can expect to see on YouTube in terms of videos out there, I'll give you just a little preview of it now. Some stuff here, Country Road, and of course a lot of videos, people showing you how to play different Paul Franklin solos, etc. So he does a couple of videos with this guy here. True Tone Lounge. He does a lot of interviews with a lot of great musicians, this guy. This is an interesting video. This is him working on an album in studio with Vince Gill. That's a very nice clip to watch if you have a chance. It's just a minute long. This is him with Frank Zappa's son, Dweezil Zappa. Just them talking about guitars. That was done for D'Addario. You can see Paul doing his clips of him playing with Dire Straits, doing solos at various big outdoor shows with Dire Straits. A bunch of stuff like this, which is Time Jumpers, and a lot of stuff with him and Vince Gill. And I think that during COVID-19 that Paul really started to become quite visible on YouTube. Presently touring with Chris Stapleton. If you like that kind of music, if you like Chris Stapleton, then yeah, you'll be hearing and seeing Paul Franklin on stage with him. And this Paul Franklin method, a big part of Paul's career has been now dedicated into this teaching method. He's becoming the ultimate professor of the steel guitar. I know many steel guitarists have been influenced and found this method to be very, very helpful. So yeah, that's basically the kind of thing you're going to find when you go searching for Paul Franklin on YouTube. There's enough stuff there to keep you busy for at least a day. And so how will Paul be remembered? Well, he'll still be with us for a number of years yet. He'll be remembered for recording on over 500 records. I showed you a sample earlier, just a very, very small sample size of albums that I had earmarked, of stuff that I saw that he played on. But there was, 15 or 1600 albums in total, I think it was, that he was credited on. We know that he's in the Musicians Hall of Fame, the Steel Guitar Hall of Fame. But I think that ultimately, in the end, that Paul's going to be remembered as much for being a teacher of the steel guitar, being someone who's very active in the community. Like, for example, Paul has been a longtime member of the Steel Guitar Forum online. He's attended different conventions of the steel guitar, and he's just really become a public figure for pedal steel guitar specifically. Paul has played pedal steel during some of the worst eras in country music. So, the 1990s, 2000s, up to 2015. I mean, these were kind of some dark years in country music for classic country music fans. So you have to consider with his legacy that he had the unfortunate circumstance of being alive and in his prime during that time, which is probably in part for why when we think of Paul Franklin, we don't necessarily have these solos that jump out in our mind as, oh, we got to hear him play with that artist on this track that he did with so-and-so. It's like, well, he's playing with Faith Hill and Rascal Flatts and stuff like that. It's a very much a different world of music than I'm into, and most of probably you watching this video are into. So I think also his father, I think they'll be remembered, the two of them. The two Paul Franklins will be equally remembered for the inventions. The Pedabro, of course, a very, very big addition to the world of steel guitar in this story. So if you have a chance to see Paul Franklin playing steel guitar in your lifetime, don't forget to take that an opportunity to do that. You still have the chance to do it, of course, as of 2025, the time of this filming. That's it for this episode, and let me know in the comments anything that you think that I might have got wrong or anything that I should have added in, and thanks so much for all the comments. It's been really, really great to connect with people all over the world and share this kind of love for the best part of country music, I think, the steel guitar. So keep it country, keep coming back, and before long, we'll see you next time.